Pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, you know what jumps out right away? How Gates looks back at his childhood. Like
Mhm.
the rocking, the intense focus, the whole not really socializing thing.
We all know that about him. Kind of classic Bill Gates, right?
Exactly. But he connects it to how we see autism today.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
not just him labeling himself. He sees these traits as key to his success, like with math, science, all that leading to programming, obviously.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about
Oh,
labels and all that.
totally. It challenges us to rethink. Gates is saying these things that might be considered different, they're actually strengths.
Especially in your field, right? You're always looking for that outside-the-box thinking.
Absolutely. This neurodiversity perspective, it's like saying, hey, let's not try to make everyone the same. Different strengths, different ways of thinking. That's where the magic happens.
And he even talks about how his parents send him to therapy, not to change him, but to help him focus that energy.
Right.
Makes you wonder if sometimes a little bit of, I don't know, that misfit energy, maybe that's what pushes things forward.
That's a good point. And he emphasizes having the right environment, too, like that school where he met Paul Allen, his Microsoft partner later on.
Right.
Talent's important, but you need a place where it can actually flourish.
And then there's that whole tech culture evolution. We've got the tech bro stereotype now.
Oh, yeah.
But Gates seems to be saying Silicon Valley, deep down, it's still about that nerdiness,
Yeah.
loving the problem solving, pushing the limits of what's possible.
And that's important because it cuts through the image, you
Yeah.
know? It's not just flash and hype. It's that deep love for tech that's still driving things.
But then he kind of throws us for a loop. He talks about how he didn't want to deal with the government much early on and calls it a mistake,
Yeah.
looking back.
Interesting shift, though, especially knowing how involved he is now with global health and all that.
You're right. Like he learned something, realized just building the tech isn't enough. You got to work with the systems that actually put it into action.
Exactly.
And speaking of working with systems, we got to talk about that dinner with Trump.
Oh, that's a good one.
3 hours. Gates, the tech guy, turned philanthropist. And Trump, well, Trump being Trump.
The length alone makes you wonder what they talked about.
And they got into some serious stuff, especially global health. This wasn't just a handshake and a photo op.
Right.
They talked about the possibility of HIV cure, still early stages then,
Yeah.
and the challenges with getting rid of polio in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Africa. Tough spots.
What strikes me is Gates doesn't present it as like this clash of opposites. He highlights how Trump was engaged, interested in these global issues, even eager to push for innovation. It's interesting.
Like maybe Gates saw a chance, despite their differences, to use that Trump energy, you know, for good.
It makes you think, how much influence can someone like Gates have on policy, even with an administration that maybe doesn't see eye to eye on everything?
Big question, especially for you, being involved in listeners' field. You think passionate advocacy can really change the course of things.
Tough one. Really makes you think.
But of course, it's not always smooth sailing.
No.
Gates mentions this big disagreement he has with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about vaccines.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Really highlights how misinformation is still a huge problem.
It is. And you've got Bill Gates himself pushing for science-backed solutions, yet it's still an uphill battle.
Makes you wonder if someone with his platform, his resources, struggles with this, what hope is there for the rest of us?
That's a valid question. It really shows how tough it is to navigate all this information out there. But maybe the answer isn't just shouting louder. Maybe it's about being smarter, understanding how these beliefs take hold, and finding ways to bridge the gap with facts, but also with empathy, you know?
That's a whole other deep dive right there.
It is.
Speaking of different approaches, Gates makes this really interesting comparison with another big tech guy, Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating contrast.
Both super influential, but the way they handle politics, totally different.
Night and day.
Gates even says they haven't spoken directly in over 18 months. And this is with them both working on tech, innovation, all that.
That silence is pretty loud, don't you think?
It is, especially with how vocal Musk is, using social media to, sway things politically.
Right.
So what's Gates' take on all that? Musk going after government spending, his comments about European politicians, that must raise some eyebrows?
Well, Gates is careful about it. He acknowledges that scrutinizing spending is important, but you can tell he's got some reservations about Musk's style.
I bet, especially when it comes to cutting programs that have long-term benefits like healthcare. Gates argues that saving money now could hurt us later, even damage relationships with other countries. He specifically mentions HIV medication.
Powerful point. Reminds us that behind all the talk about budgets and numbers, there are real people whose lives are affected by these decisions.
And then there's that part of the interview that everyone's talking about.
Yeah.
Gates and Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
He doesn't dodge it at all, calls it a huge mistake, says he feels quite stupid for being associated with him.
It's big of him to admit that, considering who he is.
It is, reminds us that even super smart people, they can misjudge things, get caught up with the wrong crowd.
And for you, in listeners' field where reputation is everything, it's a cautionary tale.
For sure, even when something seems like a good opportunity, one misstep can cost you big time.
It really makes you think, even at the top, we're all human, capable of messing up.
Sobering thought for sure. But let's zoom out a bit now, talk about the bigger worries Gates has, starting with the whole U.S. China relationship thing.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one, especially seeing how things have gone since this interview.
No kidding. And Gates was already talking about the need for more win-win situations. Like, even with the competition, there are areas where working together makes sense.
He specifically mentions climate change, healthcare, fighting terrorism, all these things that go beyond borders.
Makes sense. He's saying we can't just be stuck in this us versus them mindset. We have shared interests here.
Right.
It's a call for being practical, recognizing that even rivals got to work together when the stakes are high enough.
Absolutely.
And then, maybe the most unsettling part of the interview, how he sees pandemic preparedness.
Yeah, that one hits home now, doesn't it?
He gave a 10 to 15% chance of a natural pandemic happening in the next 4 years from when he said it, so 2016, 2017 timeframe.
Wow.
And this is someone who's dedicated so much to global health, and he's saying we're just not ready.
Chilling really shows how fragile things are. We have the knowledge, the experts, even the warnings, but are we actually putting that into action, Really preparing?
Exactly. That's the big question, and a perfect place to pause for now. We've gone from Gates's nerdiness to Trump to worrying about the future. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but we're just getting started. So much more to explore. Stay tuned.
Yeah, join us for part 2, where we'll dig deeper into Gates' journey from tech to philanthropy, see how he tackles these global problems, what works, what doesn't. Lots to learn there.
It's going to be good. Picking up where we left off, man, that pandemic prediction, it's kind of spoopy now, knowing what
It
happened.
really is. Makes you wonder, right? I mean, Gates have all those resources, all that knowledge. He was already worried back then, so why weren't we more prepared? The whole world.
It's a question we're all asking ourselves now for sure. But maybe by looking closer at Gates' work, how he tackles these huge problems, maybe there's something to learn there about how to be more ready next time.
Makes sense. It's not just about seeing the next crisis coming. It's about building systems that can handle them. And that's where it gets really interesting, how he goes from this tech giant to a global philanthropist.
Right, like he could have just chilled, enjoyed his wealth, but he jumps headfirst into this whole other world of problems. It's kind of amazing.
And he doesn't just write a check and call it a day, does he? He gets really hands-on with these global issues, disease eradication, sustainable development, all that.
Yeah, and what's really cool is he brings that same analytical, problem-solving brain that made him a tech superstar and applies it to these complex social challenges. Like, okay, how do we actually fix this? Like with vaccines,
Oh, yeah.
he's not just funding what's already out there, he's pushing for brand new tech, new ways to get those vaccines to people, even stuff like mRNA vaccines, years before anyone was talking about them.
Wow, way ahead of the curve.
It's like he sees philanthropy as this giant engineering project, finding the spots where a little bit of innovation can make a huge difference.
I like that. Leverage points, that's a good way to put it.
And he's not afraid to take risks, Invest in ideas that sound crazy at first, like that whole thing with sanitation technologies in developing countries.
Not exactly glamorous, but hey, super important.
Exactly. It's about those basic needs that we take for granted, but they make a huge difference in people's lives and their economy, too.
But even with the best intentions, you're going to hit some bumps in the road, right? Like that part where he talks about feeling quite stupid about the Epstein thing.
Yeah, that was the tough one.
Even someone as smart and experienced as Gates, he can make bad calls, misjudge people.
Reminds us that we all have blind spots. No matter how successful you get, you can still mess up.
But what I respect is that he owns it. He doesn't try to minimize it or blame someone else.
Exactly. Total accountability. He's like, yep, I screwed up, and uses it as a lesson learned. I think that's a powerful example of humility, Even at the top, you're not perfect. And it makes you wonder, if someone like Gates can admit those mistakes, shouldn't we all be a little more okay with our own screw-ups? As long as we learn from them, of course.
Absolutely. Failure is a learning experience. That's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Gates' vision for the future. especially how technology can help solve these global problems. I mean, he's been leading the digital revolution for decades, so his take on this is super valuable.
Definitely. He doesn't make specific predictions, but he points to artificial intelligence as a big area to watch. And this was back in 2016, before AI was everywhere like it is now.
So ahead of the curve again.
Seems like it. And what's interesting is he doesn't just cheerlead for AI. He talks about the potential, sure, but also the dangers, the ethical stuff, bias, misuse, all that.
He's not just blinded by the shiny new tech toy, is he?
Nope. He's calling for caution for a balanced approach where we harness the power of AI but manage the risks too, which is even more important now that AI is literally everywhere.
And it goes back to what we were talking about before, his changing view on government involvement. Remember how he admitted that not engaging early on was a mistake?
Totally. And that shift is huge. It's not enough to just invent the tech. You have to work with the people who actually implement it, regulate it, make sure it's used ethically.
So where does he stand now on government and tech? More regulation, less regulation?
He doesn't really advocate for specific policies, but he does say some regulation is necessary, especially for data privacy and how AI is used.
Sounds like he's trying to find that sweet spot, you know? Keep innovation going, but protect people at the same time.
It's a tricky balance for sure. And Gates doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he stresses how important the conversation is, getting policymakers, tech leaders, and everyday people talking about how to shape the future of technology so everyone benefits.
It's that systems thinking again, right? Seeing how technology doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a bigger web of social, political, economic stuff.
100%. And it's relevant to you too in listeners' field. Think about the technologies you're using or creating. How do they fit into the bigger picture of your industry? What could go wrong, even if you have good intentions? How can you address those issues before they become problems?
Lots to think about there. I like it. But let's zoom in on Gates's philanthropy for a minute. It's clearly not just about donating money. It's about creating lasting change. Right.
And what I find impressive is how he's all about data and evidence. He's not just going with his gut or good vibes. He's looking at the numbers, figuring out what actually works, and always trying to get better.
Like a scientific approach to giving. That's interesting.
Exactly. He's bringing that tech world mindset to social problems, and he's not afraid to try things out even if they fail, as long as he learns from it. Think about his work on fighting malaria. He's put a lot of money into bed nets, which help. But he's also funding research into gene editing to try and eliminate the mosquitoes that spread it in the first place.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is. Might not pay off right away, but if it works, it could change everything about how we control diseases.
And it highlights something else about his approach. It's not just about charity, it's about empowerment. Giving people the tools and resources to lift themselves up, build a better life. Like the saying goes, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. But Gates is thinking on a global scale.
Exactly. He's investing in education, healthcare, economic opportunities, all the things that make a society thrive. It's about understanding that people don't just need a handout, they need a hand up, the ability to create their own success.
Really resonates with me, especially with what I do in listeners' field. How can we bring that same empowerment mindset to our work, focusing on building capacity, helping people become more resilient in the face of challenges?
That's a great question. And I think it gets to the heart of what Gates is all about. It's not just what he's doing himself. It's about inspiring others to take action, use their skills and resources to make a difference.
Like a call to action for everyone.
Absolutely, saying we all have a part to play in building a better future. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. We've explored Gates's journey from tech to philanthropy, his wins and losses, his hopes and fears.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll get even more personal. Hear Gates's thoughts on success, failure, and the big lessons he's learned along the way. We'll also tackle those big picture worries that keep him up at night, and what should be keeping all of us up at night, too.
Can't wait to dig into it.
Back again, diving deep with Bill Gates, and man, what a journey it's been, right? From those early days coding to this massive global philanthropy work, the guy just doesn't stop.
It's that constant drive, that focus on making a real difference that really strikes me, you know? But he also talks about the things he's learned along the way, both the good and the bad.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from the bad stuff, like that whole Epstein thing, calling it a huge mistake, saying he feels quite stupid. It's a reality check, you know? Even the smartest people can screw up.
Definitely humbles you a bit. Doesn't matter how successful you get. We're all human. We all make mistakes, get fooled sometimes.
But I thought it was really admirable how he owned up to it. No excuses, No blaming anyone else.
Totally. Just straight up accountability, taking responsibility, using it as a lesson learned. It shows a lot of self-awareness, recognizing those blind spots we all have, something we could all probably work on.
Especially in your line of work, those decisions can have big consequences.
Absolutely makes you think about the systems we have in place, not just to prevent those mistakes, but to create a culture where it's okay to admit when you've messed up, learn from it, and move on.
That's key. Accountability, but also that growth mindset, right? But let's talk about what keeps Bill Gates up at night. Because even with all his success, all his resources, he's still deeply worried about some pretty big things.
Like pandemics and the need for countries to work together better, stuff that keeps getting more complicated, especially these days.
And these weren't just vague worries. He put a number on it, remember. 10 to 15% chance of a natural pandemic in the next 4 years. And this was back in 2016.
Right before COVID hit us.
It's kind of scary hearing him talk about it so matter-of-factly, and to think that even he felt like the world wasn't ready.
Really makes you realize, even with all the knowledge and resources out there, we're still vulnerable. It highlights how interconnected everything is, how complex these problems are. We got to be on our toes constantly.
No kidding. So what can we do? I mean, as individuals, as organizations, how do we prepare for these kinds of threats? What can we learn from what Gates is saying and apply it to our own lives, our own work?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that systems thinking, that's crucial. It's not about finding one single solution. It's about seeing the bigger picture, how everything's connected.
So thinking about your work in listeners' field, how does that apply? Where are those leverage points where you can make a difference, not just in your own organization, but ripple out further across your whole industry, maybe even beyond?
Those are the kind of questions Gates makes us ask, He's not giving us all the answers. He's pushing us to think differently about the problems and our role in solving them.
I like that, a challenge instead of a blueprint.
Exactly. And remember, it's not just about pandemics. He talks about the need for better global cooperation, too, especially between the U.S. and China. And this was when things were already tense, even back then.
And it's only gotten tougher since then, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But even with all that, Gates is saying we have to find ways to work together, especially on things like climate change, global health, issues that affect everyone.
It's a call for being practical, putting aside differences when we have to, recognizing that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
We got to look for those win-win situations where cooperation actually benefits everyone. That's a big shift in thinking for a lot of people.
It is, but it's a hopeful message, don't you think? Even when things seem impossible, even with all the conflict, there's still a chance for progress, for finding common ground and building a better future.
I like that, ending on a positive note. And that about wraps up our deep dive into the mind of Bill Gates. What a ride. It's been about technology, philanthropy, facing global challenges. But at its core, it's about human ingenuity, learning from our mistakes, and holding on to that hope that we can make things better, even when the odds are stacked against us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for our listeners, as you go about your day facing your own challenges, remember what we've talked about today. Embrace that curiosity, use your talents to make a difference, and never lose sight of the big picture because we're all in this together, and the future is ours to create.
Tuning